I was thinking that I would start with an experience that Lacan himself had with the objet. So a woman comes to him and says, I think I get your thought, but I'm having trouble with this concept of the objet. Can you explain it to me a little bit more thoroughly? And Lacan says, I can't really explain it to you. I've got to show it to you. So he takes her back into his bedroom, and then like half hour goes by, or a little bit of time goes by. They come out, and he goes, do you get it now? She goes, well, I don't understand the objet any better, but I do get the short session. So that was, sorry, that's my little Lacan joke. So I thought this was the only place I could do a Lacan joke. So yeah, I think if there's one concept that Lacan himself wanted to be known for, it was the objet, or what he, and Calum mentioned this, that he also refers to it as objet petit a. He also will call it later, starting in Seminar 16, plus de jouir, which gets translated as surplus enjoyment. Lacan, this is the one term that he insisted not be translated. And people have helped. So you'll sometimes hear people say object small a, but most of the time it's objet a. And I think the reason why he never gives a full explanation why he doesn't want it translated, but I think the reason why is because it's for him a point of singularity that is the engine for desire. And so to translate it, he felt like would be to betray the singularity of the concept. So it's in his late Seminar 21, so it's in the 70s. He's already almost at the end, a seminar called Les Non-Dupes Airs, the non-duped air. That's where Lacan says the objet petit a is perhaps what I have invented. So he doesn't say that about anything else. And I think that's probably correct, that this very audacious claim is justified because Lacan was the first to theorize desire not around what the subject wants, that is, not around the object of desire, but about what blocks what it wants, which is what Lacan calls the objet, or what hinders the subject's access to its object of desire in some way. And I think I'll try to talk about that a little bit. So Lacan uses the term objet in order to distinguish this intangible object that embodies nothing from real life, actual, tangible objects of desire. And rather than being what the subject desires, the objet is what triggers the subject to desire the object of desire. So you can think there's three parts, right? Subject desiring, objet, object of desire. And the objet is what he says, the object cause of desire. So it's the thing that drives the subject to desire this object of desire. So an object of desire can be just an ordinary object, but the objet is what gives this ordinary object an extraordinary quality that makes it desirable. Without the objet, we don't get this infusion of exceptionality or even maybe sublimity into the object of desire. The object of desire instead just remains one thing among a heap of indifferent objects. I often think of the ending of Citizen Kane where they're throwing all these different objects into a fire, and I think that's what objects are without the objet. So these are all at some point they were very valuable and desired objects, but once the objet is gone, they're just tossed into the fire. Although the other thing that's tossed into the fire is the sled, which in a certain way, sorry, I just gave away the ending of Citizen Kane. That's Rosebud. That it functions in some way that you're also getting the objet thrown away. The objet, so it sparks the subject's desire for a mundane object precisely in the way that it hinders the subject's full and direct access to it. And I think this is the really important idea of objet that Lacan himself maybe doesn't fully develop, because he's talking about it, since it's elliptical itself, he's talking about it often in an elliptical way. So it might be the wrapping paper that covers a gift. The objet would be the wrapping paper that obscures the gift. And then without the wrapping paper, the gift, however nice it is, it just becomes an ordinary object one that you could exchange for some other object. And this is what happens after you unwrap a gift. Everyone has done this, right? You get the gift. It seems when it's wrapped, it seems amazing. It seems very desirable. You unwrap it. You're like, do you have the gift receipt? I want to take this back. So that's the wrapping paper is the thing that is the difference between an exchangeable object and an object that's desired, right? That's objet. So if one laid out unwrapped presents under the Christmas tree, they would not attract the desire of children in the way that the wrapped ones do. And I think this is a nice instance of the way that objet spurs our desire by erecting a barrier between subject and object of desire. And this barrier is what makes the object desirable in the first place. I brought some show and tell. So this is I don't know if you have this anywhere. Maybe we just have it in the US. It's a Zevia. It's a nice natural drink that doesn't have any calories. But what's nice about this is the Zevia stuff, the material that I'm sometime going to drink, is the object of desire. But it's precisely this can that limits it, that is a barrier to my access to it, that makes it desirable. In contrast, I can just take a drink of water. There's no barrier to my access. The water is perfectly accessible. And so it ceases to be very desirable. I just drink it because I think I should probably drink something, not because I desire it, whereas I'm saving that Zevia for later because I have a lot of desire wrapped up in it, precisely because of the cans functioning as the barrier. So at times, objet is able to render an object of desire desirable, even without augmenting it with any enigmatic intimations of exceptionality, without spicing it up with any added desirable quality. And I think in such instances, the opposite approach of obfuscating the object in some way can function equally well. So you can think of, for example, a defect that a person can have might generate desire for this person in a way that some ideal of perfect attractiveness wouldn't. So, for instance, a mole on someone's face would impair their beauty, but it would also be the thing that makes the face appealing. So the mole in this case would be the objet that makes the perfectly attractive face into an object of desire that it wouldn't otherwise be. Or, example close to my heart, and I'm not thinking of myself, baldness might function as an objet, right? Like baldness, someone look at someone and say, well, if that person wasn't bald, they might be attractive. But of course, it's just an illusion created by the objet. Like if they really had hair, they'd say, oh, they're not really that attractive. But the baldness functions as the objet that makes the person's face or whatever desirable, precisely because it's this hint of imperfection, this barrier, this defect that is actually the condition of possibility for the object being desirable. So it's that the objet makes the perfect object just out of reach, and so that allows it to be desirable. So the defect is in this way, the thing that makes, for instance, the face or the head desirable. Direct, you might say this way, that direct access to the object is always stultifying. And I think this is why Lacan sees the barrier of objet, whether it's a tinge of sublimity or even the slight imperfection or major imperfection of baldness or slight imperfection of the mole. It's constituted by the objet as the sine qua non of desire. So without the obstacle, one would not have any impetus to desire the object. But I think what's interesting is but the point is though that a barrier in itself doesn't generate desire. So it's only in relation to an object of desire that the objet functions. So and I think this is a really key point, that it's in itself, it's nothing. So I think oftentimes you hear people say objet is this object of nothing. And I think that's what they're getting at, is all it is this relation that it has to the object of desire that it in some way obscures. It has no ontological status or even existential status for the subject on its own. By barring the direct access to the object of desire, what the objet does is it distorts the subject's perceptual field. So you might say it generates a curvature in the subject's space of perception, and it makes it impossible for a subject to look neutrally on what it sees. So there's no, objet is just another way of saying there's no neutral look at an object. So, or at the world, right? So the objet might cause someone to look at a face through, for instance, I could look, to go back to this mole example, I look through the mole and see the person. I look through the baldness and see the person. We often do this, right? Like we think the characteristic that stands out, that's exceptional about the person, which is also usually a defect, is that's what we see the person through, right? So paradoxically, I think it's as an obstacle to the complete perception of the object that the objet provides a perspective through which the subject can perceive. So it's a nice dialectical point that Lacan makes with this concept of objet, that it's the barrier to our perception that opens up perceptibility. So if we didn't have the barrier, we wouldn't desire to see or hear anything. So it's the very barrier that actually provides this access point through which the world opens up to it. So maybe put it like this: the distortion that the objet causes, creates, is constitutive of what it discloses. So without the distortion, Lacan's contention is, I think, that one could not perceive anything at all. So the objet stains the field of perception with a distortion that the subject's desire introduces into the field of perception. So because we're desiring subjects, we can't just perceive straight on neutrally. And the objet is just the name for that inability to look straight on a perceptual field. Or you could say the objet is the thing that names our inability to perceive without the distortion of desire. And in the visual field, objet represents the way that the subject's desire distorts what appears as visible. So in other words, every perceptual field is organized around a desire that makes a neutral perspective on that field impossible. So when we're looking out on some scene, we're seeing it through this object that distorts our straight-on view of the scene. It makes that straight-on view of the scene impossible. But the objet doesn't just distort the perceptual field, it is also what makes that field accessible as it distorts it, right? So this field results from the subject's desiring perspective that leaves it unable to perceive the field in a straight-on direct way. So in this sense, what opens up the perceptual field is also what makes it impossible to perceive the field without a distortion. So the distortion manifests itself within the field as the objet. And I think this is a really important point that Lacan makes. So it's not just there's a curvature of space, there's a distortion of the field of perception. It's also that when that happens, there's some manifestation of that distortion that makes itself felt within the field of perception. And Lacan gives a pretty great example of this from his own experience in Seminar 11. And if you know Lacan or have read Lacan or have even a slight acquaintance with him, maybe you'll know this. So he as a student, he was slumming it in the south of France and hanging out with the people in a fishing community and working on a boat, and just he was taking, let's say in our contemporary parlance, he was taking a gap year, even though maybe it wasn't a year. And he's out in the ocean with this guy that he calls Petit Jean, and Petit Jean thinks that he's kind of Lacan, sort of doesn't really belong in the situation where he is, and he looks at a sardine can floating on the ocean. He says, "Do you see that can? Well, it doesn't see you." And then Lacan, he's like, "Aha! Encounter with the gaze." I don't know if he thought it at the time, but subsequently thought it. And then he says an interesting thing. He says, if what Petit Jean said has any sense at all, the can saw me all the same. And so that's interesting, right? So it's not that he's not seen by the can, although the can for Lacan represents the way in which he doesn't fit within that scene. And that he feels a little bad about that. He feels like I'm trying to fit in, but I don't fit in. And so the objet embodies that failure to fit in the scene. That's why the Petit Jean points it out to him. But when he says that the can saw me all the same, the point is that our failure to fit in a scene or a situation is itself part of the situation. So that's why if the sardine can is the gaze for Lacan, gaze as form of the objet, then it's precisely the way his presence distorts what he sees. So the idea is that he has to be the objet is present at some point within the visual or perceptual field, and it's in that point, it's as a thing that disturbs or stains or upsets that perceptual field, just like that sardine can in this anecdote that Lacan recounts in Seminar 11. It's pretty great, and I think it's one of the things nice and it's interesting about it is that it really shows it's Lacan allowing himself to be seen in a less than flattering light. And as someone who tried to go into a situation and fit in, and then he didn't fit in, and the guy was making fun of him for not fitting in, and he recounts that all. And so I think it's to his credit. I also think that this encounter with the objet, so it's not, one of the things I think that's important about what Lacan says is that our relation to it is always unconscious. So we can never fully become conscious of the way that it distorts our visual field. So we can consciously in other words, we're consciously trying to look for the object of desire, not for what distorts our desire. And if we turn in what distorts our desire, objet, into what we're looking at, then we miss it. Something else becomes functioning as the objet. So I think that's a really key thing, that you can't just adopt a conscious attitude of looking for the objet. The way that you become aware of it is like in this little story that Lacan tells about the way that the object took him by surprise, right? So we get this moment where our perception breaks down. We see all of a sudden the scene is disrupted. And what happens is that all of a sudden we're looking for the object of desire, and the objet intrudes in that and makes its presence felt. And then we quickly move on. I think one of the things that is great about cinema, and this is one of the things that I really like about it, is that it allows for these encounters, precisely because in cinema, you're not directing where things go. You have to follow where the film takes you, right? That's the whole point. And so I think that because you're put in this position, which is so in everyday life, our consciousness is directing us. In cinema, we're following. So I think that cinema has more of a possibility, I would say, for an encounter with the objet and its distorting power than our everyday life. Of course, Lacan's giving an example from everyday life where it happened. But I think it's more or less rare precisely because the capacity for consciousness to take control and not let this disturbing encounter take place. So I want to look at the end of one of the most well-known films, rightfully so, of all time, Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs. So the film, I'll just recount it for you that sadly haven't seen it. I'm going to give away the end of this film as well. So the film recounts the assistance that a serial killer, Hannibal Lecter, who's played by Anthony Hopkins, provides for a fledgling CIA agent played by Clarice Starling, is her name, played by Jodie Foster. He gives her help to apprehend another serial killer nicknamed, Buffalo Bill. So he offers to help the FBI in the investigation, but as he's doing so, Lecter manages to escape from police custody and flee the country. And then at the end of the film, we see that he's somewhere in the Caribbean. We're not sure exactly where. And then he calls Starling, and the film ends with this phone call. So Lecter, she's at her FBI graduation. This is a nice moment for her. But then Lecter calls and disturbs it. So that itself is a kind of objet, this disturbance. But that's not the point I want to make. So the film, as Lecter's talking with Starling, the film shows Lecter's former jailer, the head of the psychiatric prison where he'd been held, arriving on this island, whatever it is, where he is. This guy's name is Dr. Chilton. And not only did he act sadistically toward Lecter, but he also sexually harassed Starling when she came to the prison. As audience members, we don't like him. We think he's a bad guy. The film also highlights constantly his unctuous manner in his dealing with all the other characters. So the guards at the prison, no one likes him. And in a way that we don't feel sorry for him for being unliked. He deserves to be unliked. So this background sets up this final scene. Chilton arrives, and it coincides with Lecter's call to Starling. And then in the final line of the film, Lecter says, "Sorry, I have to go." And he goes, "I'm having an old friend for dinner." And then at this moment, the film cuts to an image of Chilton, which signals that he's the old friend who Lecter plans to eat. So there's a nice pun, of course. He's having an old friend for dinner. He's going to eat. The friend is going to be his dinner, not that he's going to eat dinner with him. But it's interesting, rather than setting up the spectator to be repulsed by Lecter's continued cannibalism, which I think we can assume violates every spectator's conscious moral convictions, the film actually pushes the spectator to enjoy the prospect of Lecter eating Chilton. So one watches the final scene convinced that Chilton will get his just desserts. I'm speaking for me, but everyone I've talked to feels this way, despite one's attitude toward cannibalism. In this way, the film, I think, forces spectators to confront the objet, which is the manifestation of an unconscious desire as it's structured in the narrative form. So Lecter eating Chilton is not itself a desirable object, but it is an objet that triggers the spectator's unconscious desire. So the objet is a device through which desire is written into what is perceived. So it's the detail in the structure of the perceptual field that doesn't fit, that throws the field off. So it doesn't fit with our conception of ourselves as moral beings in this Silence of the Lamb example. And it subjectivizes the field of perception by permeating it with the subject's desire. So I think the distinction between conscious will and unconscious desire is really nicely discernible in how the objet functions. So under normal circumstances, you can't gain direct access to the distortion of your unconscious desire, but you can only do it in brief moments like this ending, I want to say, of Silence of the Lambs. So at such times, I think the effect of one's unconscious desire becomes evident as a subjective distortion in what one perceives. And I think Lacan's theorizing of the objet enables us to pay attention to such encounters and to recognize their significance rather than just dismissing it as something that doesn't matter. Okay, so given Lacan's immense debt to Freud, I think it makes sense to locate the origins of the objet in Freud's work, or to try to think about where that might be, especially because Lacan calls his own project A Return to Freud many, many times. And I think it's possible to find moments in Lacan's thinking, especially in the Seminar 8 on the transference, where he seems to imply that Freud's notion of the partial object actually serves as a precursor of sorts for the objet. Lacan, in fact, asserts that the partial object is the psychoanalytic object par excellence. He says, the object that we have learned to discern in analytic practice, what he calls it. So he proceeds to claim that post-Freudian analysts who've replaced the partial object with the whole person have betrayed the psychoanalytic project. They may have found it more palatable to believe that what the subject desires is the whole person, rather than merely a random component of the other person. But Lacan sees this as a problem because he sees that when they swap the partial object for the whole person, they discard one of Freud's most important discoveries. That desire tends to latch itself on a detail, the importance of which can be totally opaque or even indiscernible to the desiring subject. So we don't, even as the subject desiring, I don't know why I'm desiring this thing or this person. Yet, I think despite this promising conceptual lead that the partial object provides, Freud, no matter how, even the broadest interpretation of Freud, I don't think provides sufficient resources for understanding how the objet develops. So Freud's conception of the unconscious as the other scene in the psyche, that operates with a different logic than that of consciousness. It's clearly compatible with Lacan's idea of the unconscious. But what's interesting is that Freud seldom employs the German words for desire. So Verlangen, Sehnsucht, Begierde, which is Hegel's favorite word. Instead, the word that predominates in his writing, especially interpretation of dreams, is Wunsch, or wish, a concept that Freud applies equally in the context of consciousness and the unconscious, which should be very strange to us. Lacan explicitly distances his conception of unconscious desire from the Freudian Wunsch, precisely due to the latter's ability to be conscious, that we can have a conscious Wunsch. Although he follows Freud's thinking in terms of on the unconscious, Lacan doesn't find his conception of desire, which is central to theorizing the objet, in Freud's work. So this is why I think the objet and its origin has to be found elsewhere, not in Freud. And I think the place to look for where it starts to emerge is in the thought of Alexandre Kojève. So Kojève's he gave seminars on Hegel in the late 1930s that Lacan attended religiously, so religiously that he also had a second session at his house that Kojève came to, a little special in-group that got to have the double session. When Kojève interprets Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, he takes the dialectic of the master and servant, he calls master and slave, this is basically Kojève's invention, as paradigmatic for Hegel's entire philosophical enterprise. It's a start. There are other things he talks about, but it's really startling how important master-slave dialectic is for Kojève versus how not so important it is for Hegel. But as a consequence, I think the desire for recognition that bursts this dialectic occupies a central position in Kojève's philosophy. So much so that Kojève interprets the entire history of the world through the desire for recognition and its various failures. History comes to an end, he postulates, when this desire for recognition concludes in a state of mutual recognition, which occurs with the ultimate victory of the slave. And he waffles on when this. First he says it's Napoleon, then he says it's when Stalin emerged, then he says it's the U.S., and then finally he was ambassador to Japan for a while. He's like, no, it's Japanese society. That's this end of history. So he has four different ideas for what it is, and then he finally has a conclusion. Anyway, Lacan doesn't inherit Kojève's propensity for philosophizing about the end of history. He doesn't care about that. But he does take up, I think, with a pretty important modification, Kojève's understanding of desire. But where Kojève sees a desire for recognition, Lacan reconceptualizes desire as what escapes the realm of recognition. And I think this is maybe his most important psychoanalytic, philosophic, theoretical contribution. And I think it's also what is most original about his thought. The point, and it's I would say it this way, I think it's the point at which he brings together Kojève and Freud. I would like to say Hegel and Freud, but I think it's just Kojève and Freud. So Kojève's understanding of the desire for recognition, it's important that it does not necessitate an unconscious. So one can consciously desire recognition. It might make you feel bad. Oh, why do I always want the recognition of the popular kids? But it's not necessarily unconscious. However, Lacan insists and recognizes that that desire has to be unconscious. And by introducing the objet as what's irreducible to recognition, Lacan accomplishes a great theoretical leap. And I think objet, so the idea is that it's precisely the point at which recognition fails, the point at which we don't fit, that's where our desire is drawn. And I think that's something that does not exist in Kojève and doesn't exist in all of the subsequent thinkers that think about desire as the desire for recognition. So Kojève, what he theorizes as desire for recognition, however, I think Lacan rechristens as demand. So for Lacan, the subject's conscious demand for recognition is merely part of the story, that because this demand always houses an unconscious desire that's driven by the objet. So the unconscious desire motivated by the objet doesn't yearn for the other's recognition, but for the other's desire. So subject doesn't desire the other to recognize it, but desires the desire of the other. It desires that means two different things for him. So it desires to capture the other's desire, to become the object of this desire, and to access what the other desires. So the two senses of desire of the other are at odds with each other, but I think this is important. So to desire but to become what the other desires, to make oneself desirable, is different than to desire in the way that the other desires. But Lacan plays on this ambiguity because he's interested in the impossible status of the other's desire for the subject. That it's impossible for the subject to figure out the desire of the other. Why? Because the other doesn't know what it desires either. So the subject is always interpreting the other's desire. And Lacan famously says desire is interpretation. That's what he means, that there's no direct access to this desire of the other. And the particular singular way that the subject interprets the other's desire is the objet. That is the singularity. Objet is the singularity of the subject. So when Lacan says desire is interpretation, he emphasizes the importance of the subject's response to the desire of the other, and how the subject's own desire can take shape only through its interpretation of what the other desires. And this interpretation always reveals the truth of the subject's desire rather than, say, the unconscious desire of the other that's being interpreted. So there's no desire, Lacan thinks, outside the subject's interpretation of the other's desire. In other words, the actual desire of the other doesn't matter at all for the development of the subject's own desire. The way that the subject interprets the other's desire is, for the subject, the other's desire. There's nothing else. This then becomes the model for the subject's own desire. So it takes the way that it interprets what the other's desire is and then makes that its own. So you can't say also, wait a minute, what's my desire? I don't care about the desire of the other. I want to know what my own desire is. For Lacan, you can't say that, right? Because the desire is the desire of the other. So first, my desire begins as the other's desire, my interpretation of that. So when the other makes a demand on the subject, say, it instructs me to never tell a lie, the subject must always interpret the demand for the desire it contains. So the desire can be embedded within, the problem is that the desire is embedded within the demand and never self-evident. So the other also has an unconscious, so the demand contains a desire that even the other doesn't have immediate access to. So by interpreting the other's demand, the subject arrives at its own desire, which is what it extracts from the desire lurking behind the other's demand. For instance, let's take this demand for honesty. Don't tell a lie. Very Kantian demand. So the demand for honesty, however, is never a demand. The demand for honesty is never a desire for total honesty. It always includes a desire for a certain transgression of this demand. And this is what the subject has to interpret when confronted with this demand. Let's just take an example. A romantic partner says, tell me the truth of all your previous sexual encounters and how satisfying they were. Okay, so it's a terrible example. Which I said this to my girlfriend in high school. So I demanded total honesty. But the demand houses a different and unconscious desire. Unfortunately, she didn't get this, and this is why I'm with someone else now. Or she got wise. So perhaps the subject interprets this desire as a desire that invites it to lie about its past sexual experiences, which is true, right? Like the person wants the very question itself is like, no, you're the only one. The other one's meant nothing to me. So that's a lie, but it's precisely the desire that's hidden beneath the demand. So the interpretation of the desire that the subject perceives as embedded within the demand actually orients the subject's encounter with the other and structures the subject's own desire. So an unconscious desire accompanies every conscious demand and requires an active interpretation to be accessed. Even though this interpretation necessarily misses the actual desire of the other, it nonetheless animates the subject. So the way that we interpretation is always misinterpretation of the desire of the other, and that misinterpretation is objet. It's interesting. So I mentioned Lacan's seminar on the transference. So objet doesn't exist throughout Lacan's trajectory. And I think this is very important that it's something that he thinks it's the central concept, but it only comes up at a specific point. So it comes up just after the seminar on ethics of psychoanalysis, where he introduces the concept of Das Ding and then more or less drops it. And then in the very next seminar, it's a seminar on the transference, Lacan has a lengthy discussion of Plato's Symposium. And in that discussion, he refers to this enigmatic object called the Agama. And it is what causes desire to erupt precisely in the way that the objet will in the subsequent Seminar 9 on identification the next year. So according to Lacan, Alcibiades desires Socrates because he believes that Socrates possesses some especially powerful version of the Agama, the secret treasure that he hopes to access through a sexual relationship with Socrates. The Agama is a direct forerunner of objet insofar as it drives the desire of Alcibiades and yet remains irreducible to any positive object of desire. In this case, Socrates himself or any of his characteristics. It would have been interesting if, like, the Socrates' snub nose was his Agama, but Lacan doesn't go that way, nor does the Symposium. It is in this way the Agama, precisely because it's the engine driving desire that triggers desire. It is a forerunner of objet, which is developed in precisely the next seminar. So even if he could have convinced Socrates to have sex with him, there would be no way to find the objet or the Agama, because it's precisely what is always not there. And I think it's interesting to think that the status of objet in relationship to Lacan's earlier thinking about the mirror, right? So the point is that for Lacan, the mirror allows the subject, and this is in the mirror stage essay, so he first started writing this in 1935, but then published in 49. It's about 15 years before he fully starts to theorize objet. In the point of the mirror stage is that I look in the mirror and I get a sense of mastery that I otherwise wouldn't have. So I see something that's not there that allows me to overcome my sense of, at least in an imaginary way, my sense of fragmentation. What's interesting about objet is that it's precisely what can't be seen in the image. So rather than allowing me to overcome my fragmentation, it's the point of non-specularity in the image that undermines any sense of wholeness that I might have. So rather than giving me a sense of wholeness, it takes that away from me. And I think there's a nice opposition between the ideal ego that one tries to see in the mirror and the objet, especially in the form of gaze, that one sees it when one looks at an image, right? So I think that objet is in a certain way the reverse side of the mirror stage, and his thinking about that. So the seminar that fleshes out objet in the most detailed and celebrated fashion is Seminar 11, The Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. This is from 1963 to 1964. What I find interesting about this is that even though Lacan gives objet a great amount of attention in this seminar, it doesn't have the status of one of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, which the seminar is about. So these fundamental concepts are unconscious, repetition, transference, drive. The point is, though, that objet plays a central role in the operation of each of these concepts. And that's what Lacan details in this seminar. So the objet exists only insofar as it's unconscious. The repeated failure to encounter it is the drive. That's repetition. And the objet is what triggers the transferential relationship, and the drive is what misses continually the objet and what is fueled by this missing of it. So it's interesting that objet provides the through line of this seminar, and yet it doesn't have the status of one of the fundamental concepts. I think because it's not one of the fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, because it is the fundamental object of psychoanalysis. That is, it's an object without which the fundamental concepts couldn't possess the centrality that they do. So for Lacan, objet is an absent object irreducible to the subject's perceptual field. It shapes what the subject perceives, but it can never be part of the subject's perceived. So one might say that it's how one perceives, but not what. So it doesn't exist among empirical objects that one might encounter in the world. However, Lacan does claim, and this is it's sort of a compelling way to think about it, and then he drops it. So he starts out by saying there are four versions of the objet. So two versions that Freud associates, two objects, Freudian objects, breast and feces, and then two that Lacan himself adds. I've alluded to one, the gaze, and then the other one is the voice. And then he works out these two examples in Seminar 11, Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. And then in Seminar 13, he does this interesting thing where he works out how desire and demand either coming from the subject or coming from the other, relate to these four different objects, so that you can map the different versions of the objet on the relationship between the subject and the other. And this is really important, I think, because the objet is for Lacan the glue. It's not really a glue because it's nothing, right? But it's the connective tissue that attaches the subject to the other. So without this, there's no connection between the subject and the big other. So these four forms of the objet, again, breast, feces, gaze, voice, are not for Lacan exhaustive, but they're indicative of the basic relationship that the subject has to the big other. So gaze and voice, even though those aren't Freudian objects, gaze and voice are the most common manifestations of the objet, and they're the ones that the subject deals with on an everyday basis. Not to say that we don't all deal with feces on hopefully an everyday basis too. But what's interesting is the objet is not a positive object that you perceive, but the absent object. So when we're dealing with them, when we look, we're not confronting gaze in a direct way. We're confronting the gaze as what's missing and shaping our field. At the same time, when one listens, one hears through the missing voice. One doesn't hear the voice. So it's the absence of the objet that serves to structure the perceptual, this visual and oral field for the subject, and it gives it a path to relate to the other that enables the subject to avoid becoming closed in on itself. So the objet is really the opening to otherness or to anything else outside of subjectivity. So it provides an opening for every subject, but every subject has a different form of objet that it's dealing with. So it's a structuring absence that the subject relates to the other, that allows the subject to relate to the other, because the absence provides an orientation for the subject that it otherwise wouldn't have. And so for Lacan, objet names this orientation of the subject's desire that allows it to relate to the other. It's interesting, after Seminar 13, which is a seminar on the psychoanalytic object, Lacan stops referring altogether to these four forms of the objet. He doesn't stop talking about objet, but he stops saying breast, feces, gaze, voice. Instead, he begins to think of it more broadly, and he thinks objet is this lack that then becomes excessive. So because the subject lacks the objet is precisely what makes the subject prone to excesses of enjoyment. And the objet, one might say, is what is not there that enables us to take an excessive interest in what is. Okay, I'll stop there.